Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Next thing you know the next thing. Next is Now is a short podcast discussing agriculture's emerging next-gen tech and trends as they're happening in our industry. Next is Now, presented by GFL Ag. Listen where you get your podcasts today.
All right, for Real Agriculture, I'm Kelvin Hepner at the 2024 Crops Convention here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and pleased to be joined once again by Steve Verheul, former Chief Negotiator, Trade Negotiator for Canada. And Steve, coming off your presentation here at the Crop Convention, a lot of, I don't know if I want to say pessimism, but not a lot of optimism when it comes to the trajectory of global trade right now when it comes to protectionism and countries moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we're seeing a real movement away from the dedication to trade liberalization, the rules-based approaches we have at the WTO and in our bilateral agreements, less respect for those. And I think we're moving in a direction where we are seeing a lot more protectionism and a lot more industrial strategy, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of examples, but I think the question that a lot of people are asking is, what can we do about it, or what are the reasons for optimism or hope that this trajectory can be reversed, that this course can be changed? Is there a place for Canada in that?
I think there's a significant place for Canada in that, because I think for the U.S. and some of the other larger countries that have been the ones that are largely responsible for moving away from trade rules, that's not where Canada wants to go. As a mid-sized country, we rely on trade rules to keep the game fair and to give us access to other markets that's more secure. But there are many countries in the same kind of position. Most of the countries that are mid-sized depend on trade, want to expand their trade, and want to be protected from the larger countries just being able to do whatever they want to do. So there's a big constituency out there, I think.
What would some examples be, or name some country names?
Well, I think there are a lot, and we've worked with them in the past, particularly at the WTO, because we've had common cause. So it's everyone from Norway, Switzerland in Europe, and some others, Australia, New Zealand, most definitely, some others in Southeast Asia. We've got allies in Latin America and Central America, countries, again, that rely on trade and need to have those rules in place.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of political uncertainty right now as well with, one of the speakers today said over half the world is potentially going to the polls in 2024. Do you expect that some of this may calm down, or that there could be a settling down after this election cycle is completed?
Well, it's a little unclear. I think it largely depends on what happens in the U.S. Because that's the election everybody is really watching. And if we do see a re-election of Trump, then we're likely to see some more disruption to the usual world order. He's talked about an across-the-board tariff of 10%. He's talked about being able to match tariffs of other countries. And those kinds of ideas, if they come to pass, breach every single trade agreement that the U.S. is a party to.
Mm-hmm. The problem there is, I guess, there isn't much for enforcement mechanisms at this point.
Well, yes, and we go back to the U.S. in that case, because they are the ones that are not approving the appointment of appellate body members to the WTO. So the WTO dispute settlement system is completely ineffective, and the U.S. has found, unlike in the past, that the existing rules, even in the new NAFTA, can be kind of cumbersome at times, and they'd rather just not follow those rules.
Yeah. Well, even if we see the other scenario in the U.S. election, the current administration hasn't necessarily been pro-trade or out there signing trade deals and moving an agenda looking outside the country in that way either.
No, even with the Biden administration, it's been very much America first, focused on the domestic economy, not paying a lot of attention to what's going on in the rest of the world, not wanting to show a leadership role. So yeah, it's not as if one track is great for us and the other track isn't. Both tracks are problematic, and we have to deal with them. But I think What concerns us the most is that the division within the U.S., which really makes any kind of leadership effort from the U.S. very difficult because the situation is so volatile. You've got the country virtually split in half in terms of views, and very difficult to get a national consensus on where to go.
Yeah. In many ways, you would have been kind of the captain of Team Canada last time around. That Team Canada approach has been renewed. Mm-hmm. Do you see that approach having the same effectiveness as it did last time around in terms of raising awareness about the importance of trade in individual jurisdictions in the U.S.?
Well, that is the approach that's being followed. They're preparing all the groundwork to be able to demonstrate on a state level, municipal level in some cases, with congressmen, with government representatives in the U.S., with think tanks, with media, all in an effort to demonstrate how important Canada is to the U.S. The additional element that is more prominent this time is that they're also emphasizing the security element, how important we are to U.S. economic security, U.S. national security, infrastructure, supply chains, those kinds of things, part of which has come out of COVID, of course.
The whole friend-shoring concept.
Oh, exactly.
Are you a fan of friend-shoring, or is that something you believe in?
Well, not exactly, no. I mean, I can understand why countries with common values would want to trade mostly with each other, and to some extent that certainly makes sense. But for a country like Canada, we export to almost every country in the world. If we start narrowing down our market in the countries we trade with, that's going to have a pretty big hit on our economic potential.
Yeah. So, in terms of Canada building this coalition of like-minded countries or countries with similar interests, do you think that coalition could effectively, potentially, get the U.S. back on board in terms of looking beyond its borders on the trade front?
I think that's possible. If that kind of effort could get some traction and start to put together some ideas that would be viable, and then I think certainly the U.S., it would be easier for the U.S. to then join that kind of effort than initiate it on its own. And I think the European Union would also welcome an effort like that too, and be very eager to get on board. I just don't think the U.S., the EU, others are in a position to show leadership right now, so it's got to come from somewhere.
Okay. Do you fear that the costs of protectionism need to become greater than they are already before some of these countries and the political willpower will be there to go back to having more of a coalition or multilateral approach?
Well, I hate to think how far it might need to go in order to do that, particularly because protectionism, to a certain degree, and for certain countries, works to some extent. And the problem is that it doesn't create wealth on a broader basis, and that does come back to haunt the economy after a while. But in the short term, it can seem satisfying to be bringing more jobs in, more investment, that kind of thing. So it may take a while before we get to a point where countries can go beyond their own political reactions domestically and look at what the longer-term interests really are.
Yeah, and in a day and age of social media and the short political cycles, that seems to be quite a challenge.
It does. I mean, it's a challenge in politics generally that you always have to have a short-term view because that's when the next election is. But the interests of the country may well be in a longer-term view and longer-term strategies. And I think that's where we're at now. There is not a clear, coherent, longer-term vision that we're seeing that countries are coalescing around. Every country is kind of going its own way right now.
Yeah. Do you see... Of course, climate is a major priority for a lot of governments around the world, and maybe the pendulum might be moving away from that again, but do you see untapped potential in terms of a climate argument for free trade?
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why we're kind of losing the power of our trade agreements. They haven't been keeping up with the way that the economy and various other issues have been developing, and climate is one of them. Because countries are investing in preparing for climate change, and that means imposing more costs on their producers in many cases, and those producers are justifiably saying, if I'm spending this much more to address climate change, and these imports that are coming in, countries they're coming from, are not investing that same kind of money, how can I compete fairly? And so I think the world of trade needs to think more about how to incorporate those kinds of elements into the rules that get developed in the future. But there's no sign that that's really starting.
Yeah. Well, I guess Europe's trying carbon border adjustments, and the U.S. is talking about their own version.
Well, yes, and those are certainly efforts that are being undertaken, and they're being undertaken with some other countries too. The problem is, it's every country pursuing its own path. Like the U.S. and the EU have tried to converge on a single approach that the two of them could take, which would be helpful in showing leadership, but they're very far apart. And so when you don't have a broader direction to go that other countries can follow, we're all just kind of drifting along in that policy space.
Yeah. Again, taking it back to Canada and Canadian agriculture specifically, if we look at carbon intensity of crops grown in Canada, I think there's a favorable story and probably unrecognized value of Canadian crops globally on that front. To me, that would also be an argument, or would you say that's also an argument in favor of more open trade globally from a climate perspective, that we're not necessarily having, the more protectionism there is, the less likely we are to actually have the right products grown in the right areas from an efficient climate efficiency perspective?
Well, yeah, those are two competing pressures. I think Canada does have a huge advantage because of our environmentally friendly production practices and the kinds of investments we've made and our producers have made. So that should be a selling point around the world, because it's helping advance the cause of addressing climate change more broadly. But as you say, if that just runs into blind protectionism that's not even going to be tied to the climate issues, then that's going to frustrate that effort. But we should have a big advantage because we're one of the few net exporters of agricultural products. Combine that with our climate profile, and we should be doing extremely well in the future in those markets.
Okay. Final question then, Steve. We could potentially see a change in government here in Canada as well. We've talked about other countries, but in Canada as well in the next couple of years. Does that, do you think that will have a significant effect on our approach to trade beyond our borders?
Well, at this stage, I don't think it's clear, because I don't think I've heard either the Liberals or the Conservatives talking much about a longer-term vision of where we should be going. And I think that's something that's really missing, and I'm hoping that both parties could start to think more about that, because I think its importance to the future of Canadian agriculture is difficult to overstate.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for your time and your insight again, and look forward to our next conversation, Steve. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.